Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. Chapter 42, Beelzebub in America, Part 2. Now, my boy, absorb carefully the information about the causes of the gradual disharmonization in the presences of these contemporary beings of the continent America, of their second fundamental being function, namely the function of sex. The disharmony of this function in them is due also to several causes of diverse character, but the fundamental cause, in my opinion, is their negligence engendered in their essence, and already quite fused with their nature in keeping their sex organs clean. Just like the beings of the continent of Europe, the care they give to their faces, and their use of what is called facial cosmetics, are only equalled by their neglect of these said organs of theirs. Whereas more or less conscious three-brained beings are required to observe the utmost cleanliness in respect to just these organs. They cannot, however, be entirely blamed, because in this respect, the beings of the continent of Europe are most at fault with their customs existing in the process of their ordinary being existence. The point is that this as yet recently arisen contemporary large group is almost exclusively formed and continues to be supplied with beings from various large and small groups populating the continent of Europe. The result is that even if the majority of the three-brained beings now composing this newly formed large group there are not themselves emigrants from the continent of Europe, their fathers or grandfathers were, who, migrating to this continent of America, took along with them also their European customs, among which were those which brought about this uncleanliness in respect of their sex organs. So, my boy, when I now tell you how the matter stands as regards the sex question among the Americans, bear in mind that everything I say will also refer to the beings of the continent Europe. The results of this uncleanliness of the contemporary three-brained beings of the planet Earth who have taken your fancy and who breed on the continents of Europe and America are very clearly indicated in my statistics. Let's take, for example, what are called there venereal diseases. These diseases are so widespread on the continent of Europe and on this continent of America that at the present time you will scarcely ever meet a being who has not one or another form of those diseases. There is no harm in your knowing, among other things, a little more about those interesting and peculiar data, which in my statistics indicate in figures how much more of these diseases there is among the beings of the continents America and Europe than among those of the continent Asia. Many of these venereal diseases are entirely absent among the beings of the old communities of the continent of Asia, whereas among the beings populating the continents Europe and America, these diseases are almost epidemical. Let's take, for example, what is called the clap, or as scientists there call it, gonorrhea. On the continent of Europe and America, almost all the beings, both of male and female sex, have this disease in one of its different stages. But on the continent Asia, it is met with only on the borders where beings frequently mix with the beings of the continent of Europe. A good example of what has just been said are the beings belonging to the group existing there under the name Persia, which occupies a relatively large territory on the continent Asia. Among the beings dwelling in the central, eastern, southern and western areas of this relatively large territory, the mentioned diseases are not to be found at all. But in the northern part, especially in the locality called Azerbaijan, which comes into direct contact with the large half-European, half-Asiatic community called Russia, the percentage of beings infected with this disease increases more and more in proportion to their proximity to this Russia. And exactly the same occurs in other eastern countries of the continent of Asia. The percentage of this disease increases proportionately to the contact of their beings with the beings of the continent of Europe. For example, in the country called India, and partly in China, this disease has in recent times become widespread among the beings there, chiefly in those places where they come into contact with European beings of the community England. It can thus be said that the chief disseminators of this disease among the beings of the continent Asia are from the northwestern side the beings of the large group Russia, and from the eastern side the beings of the community England. The cause of the absence of this disease, as well as of many other evils in the said parts of the continent of Asia, is, in my opinion, that the majority of the beings of the continent Asia have several very good customs for their everyday existence, which have reached them likewise from their ancient ancestors. And these customs are so deeply implanted in their everyday existence by their religion that at the present time, observing them mechanically, without any wiseacring, beings are thereby more or less insured against several evils, which, owing to the abnormally established conditions of being existence, have been gradually formed, and still continue to be formed, in uncountable numbers on that ill-fated planet. The beings of most of the groups of the continent Asia are safeguarded against many venereal diseases, as well as against any other sexual abnormalities, if only, for instance, by such customs known there by the names Suniat and Abdest. The first of these customs, namely Suniat, or as it is otherwise called, circumcision, not only saves most of the Asiatic beings of responsible age from many venereal diseases there, but also safeguards many of the children and youths of that continent against a scourge mercilessly spread among the children and youths of the continents of Europe and America, namely that scourge known there under the name onanism. According to this custom, the beings of responsible age in most of the contemporary groups of the continent of Asia usually perform on their results, that is to say on their children, at a certain age, a ritual which consists in this, that in the case of boys they cut what they call the frenum and prepuce of the penis. And today those children of your contemporary favourites, who of course automatically are subjects of this custom, are almost completely safeguarded against the inevitable result of several evils already definitely fixed in the process of the existence of your favourites. For example, according to my statistics, the said scourge, that is, children's onanism, is scarcely met with among the children of those three-brained beings there who observe this custom of circumcision, whereas all the children and youths of the beings who fail to observe this custom are, without exception, exposed to the same sexual abnormality. The second custom I mentioned, namely abdest, which, by the way, is called differently by the beings of different groups on the continent Asia, is nothing else than the obligatory ablution of the sex organs after every visit to what is called the toilet. Thanks chiefly to this second custom, most of your favourites breeding on the continent of Asia are safeguarded against many venereal diseases and other sexual abnormalities there. Having said this, Beelzebub became thoughtful, and after a long pause said, "The present theme of our conversation has reminded me of a certain very interesting conversation which I had there during my sojourn in France with a young sympathetic three-brained being. I think that perhaps it would now be best for your understanding of all that has just been said, if I repeat to you that conversation in full, all the more so as, besides explaining the meaning of the custom abdest or ablution, this conversation will enlighten you on many further questions concerning the peculiar psyche of these favourites of yours." This same being, my conversation with whom I recall and now intend to repeat to you, was just that young Persian, who, you remember, as I've already told you, was at the request of our mutual acquaintances, my guide in the city of Paris, where I happened to be, as I've already told you, just before my departure to this same continent, America. One day I was waiting for this young Persian in a café in the city of Paris, as always the same grand café. When he arrived, I noticed by his eyes that this time he was, as they say there, more drunk than usual. In general, he always drank more than enough of the alcoholic liquids existing there, and when we happened to be together in Paris, in the restaurants on Montmartre, well, it was obligatory to order champagne, which I neither liked nor drank. He would always drink it all alone with great pleasure. Besides always drinking, he was also, as is said there, a great petticoat chaser. The moment he saw what they call there the pretty face of a being of the female sex, his whole body and even his breathing suddenly changed. When I noticed that he was this time more intoxicated than usual, and when, having sat down beside me, he ordered coffee with what is called there an apéritif, I asked him, "Explain to me, please, my young friend, why do you always drink this poison?" To this question of mine he answered, "Eke, my dear doctor, I drink this poison in the first place because I'm so accustomed to it that I cannot now stop drinking without suffering, and secondly, I drink it because only thanks to the effect of the alcohol can I calmly look on at the obscenity which goes on here," he added, waving his hand around. I began drinking this, as you called it, poison, because the accidental and for me unlucky and wretched circumstances of my life were so arranged that I had to come and live a long time in this maleficent Europe. I first began to drink because everybody here whom I met also drank, and unless you drink, you are called a woman, a girl, dolly, dearie, sissy, ninny, and similar derisive names. Not wishing my business acquaintances to call me by these offensive names, I also began to drink. And in addition, also thanks to the fact that when I first came over to Europe, conditions of life here in respect of morality and patriarchality were entirely in contrast with those conditions in which I was born and brought up. I, seeing and perceiving all this, used to experience a painful feeling of shame and an unaccountable embarrassment. At the same time, I noticed that, from the effect of the alcohol I drank, not only was the depression I experienced alleviated, but I could look upon it all quite calmly, and even have the wish to participate in this abnormal life, so contradictory of my nature and my established views. Thus it came about that every time I began to feel the same unpleasant sensation, I began to drink this alcohol, even with a feeling of some self-justification, and in this way gradually became accustomed to this, as you have quite justly called it, poison. Having said this with a perceptive impulse of heartfelt grief, he paused a while to puff at his cigarette mixed with tambac, and taking this opportunity I asked him as follows, "Well, all right, let us assume I have more or less understood your explanation of your inexcusable drunkenness, and can put myself in your position. But what do you say about your other, and from my point of view also inexcusable vice, namely your petticoat drooling? Why, you run after every petticoat if only it hangs about someone with long hair." At this question of mine he, sighing deeply, resumed his speaking as follows. "It seems to me that I got this habit as well partly for the reason I mentioned, but I think this weakness of mine can be explained by still another very interesting psychological cause." Of course, I expressed a desire to hear him, but first I suggested our going inside that grand café, into the hall of the restaurant itself, as it was already getting damp out of doors. We were seated in the hall of the restaurant, and had ordered their famous champagne. He continued as follows. "When you lived among us in Persia, my dear doctor, you perhaps happened to observe the attitude existing there very specific for our Persians of men towards women. Namely, among us in Persia, men have two definite, one can say, organic attitudes towards women, in accordance with which women are for us men, even unconsciously on our part, very sharply divided into two categories. The first attitude is towards the women, the present or future mother, and the second towards the woman female. This property of the men in our Persia, who have in their nature for these two independent attitudes and for this instinctive feeling, began to be formed only recently, about 2.5 centuries ago. According to the explanations once given me by my mullah uncle, whom those around him called behind his back a mullah of the old school, it seems that 2 or 3 centuries ago, owing to causes evidently ensuing from certain higher world laws, men began to make war on each other everywhere on the earth, and especially among us in Asia, more intensively than usual, and at the same time, somehow in most of the men, the feeling of piety began very distinctly to decline, and in some of them entirely disappeared. And just at that period, a certain form of psychic disease spread among men, from which many who were infected by it ultimately either became quite insane or committed suicide. These certain wise people of various independent groups on the continent of Asia began, with the help of various persons representative of medicine of that time, which, by the way, was then very superior to contemporary medicine, very earnestly to seek the causes of that human misfortune. After long impartial labours, they discovered, in the first place, that the men who contracted this disease were exclusively those in whose subconsciousness, for some reason or other, there never arose any impulse of faith in anybody or anything, and secondly, that those adult men who periodically performed the normal ritual of intercourse with women were not at all subject to this disease. When the news of this conclusion of theirs spread over the continent of Asia, all the rulers and chiefs of the separate Asiatic groups of that time grew alarmed, as almost all the regular troops at their disposal consisted of adult men, and moreover, the constant wars permitted none of them to live normally with his family. In view of the fact that at that period all the governments of the separate Asiatic countries needed and wished to have healthy and strong armies, they were compelled to conclude a truce, and either themselves assemble or send their representatives to one place, namely to the capital of what was then called the Kilmantushian Khanate, in order jointly to find a way out of the situation which had arisen. After several reflections and deliberations, these rulers of the various independent groups of Asiatic peoples, or their representatives, together of course with the representatives of medicine of that time, then came to the conclusion that it was possible to deal with the situation which had arisen, only if what is called prostitution should be established everywhere on the continent of Asia, as is now the case on the continent of Europe, and only if the power-possessing people should deliberately encourage its development and cooperate in its successes. Almost all the chiefs of the governments of that time fully agreed with this conclusion of the representatives of all the peoples of the continent of Asia, who had gathered together in the capital of the Kilmantushian Khanate. And without experiencing any remorse of conscience, they began from then on not only to encourage and aid women in general, except indeed just their own daughters, to engage in this occupation so abhorrently repulsive to the nature of every normal person, but also to give, even with a feeling of benevolence, as if this were the most considerate manifestation of man, every possible assistance to women, without distinction of caste or religion, who might wish to leave or to go anywhere for this filthy purpose. Now that we have touched upon this subject, allow me, respected doctor, to digress, and tell you here the reflections, in my view, very interesting and wise of this same mullah uncle of mine, concerning the causes in general of the arising of this evil and scourge of contemporary civilization. Once on one of the days of Ramadan, when we were conversing as usual, while awaiting the call of the mullah of our district announcing the meal hour, and we happened to be speaking about this human scourge, he then, among other things, said, "It is wrong and unjust of you to blame and despise all women of this kind. Most of them are not themselves personally to blame for their sad lot. One should blame exclusively only their parents, husbands, and guardians. And precisely their parents, husbands, and guardians should be blamed and despised who have allowed the arising in them during their age preparatory to adult being, while as yet they have not their own good sense of the property called laziness. Although at this age this laziness is as yet only automatic in them, and young people have not to make very great efforts to overcome it, and are able in consequence, on acquiring their own good sense, not to allow it to gain complete control of them. Yet, nevertheless, as regards the organisation of women's psyche, the active principle must, owing to results not dependent on our will, but ensuing from world laws, unfailingly participate in every initiative and in every good manifestation of theirs. And it is just precisely in the early years of the adult life of these contemporary unfortunate prospective women mothers, thanks to the various ideas of the people of contemporary civilization concerning equal rights for women, existing there under the catchwords equal rights, equal opportunities, etc., ideas which are now already widespread everywhere on the earth, which are naive to the understanding of a man who has lived his life normally, and which are unconsciously accepted also by the majority of contemporary men, that these contemporary, not yet completely formed prospective woman mothers, on the one hand, not having around them the law-conformable requisite sources of the active principle, such as their parents, guardians and husbands, to whom the responsibility for them passes from the moment of marriage, and on the other hand, thanks to the intensive process of imagination and enthusiasms, which is proper to proceed in them, and which is also in this transitional age foreordained by nature according to law, for the purpose of better actualizing the data for the development of their good sense, they, as it were, gradually absorb the said automatic laziness into their very nature, and this laziness remains in their nature as a progressive and indispensable necessity. A woman with such a nature, of course, does not wish to fulfill the obligations of a genuine woman mother, and in view of the fact that being a prostitute enables her just to do nothing and to experience great pleasure, there is gradually formed in her, both in her nature and in the passive consciousness proper to her, a factor for the irresistible urge to be a woman female. But in consequence of the fact that in the instinct of each of these women, the data proper to all women for the impulse of shame are not atrophied suddenly and at once, and none of them with all her mental wishing can endure to become such a woman in her own native country, every one of them always instinctively and half-consciously tries to get away to some other country, where, far from her native land, without any inner discomfort, and also without doing anything, she can abandon herself entirely to this profession, personally pleasant for her in almost every respect. And as regards the prevalence everywhere on the earth at the present time of this human misfortune, the cause of this is, in my opinion, exclusively only those contemporary men in whom, owing to the same reasons, there arises, as in those young women, future prostitutes, a similar what is called organic essential need to do nothing except enjoy oneself. And one of the forms of satisfying the criminal need for these ulcers among contemporary people consists, in the given case, in enticing and assisting such women to leave their native land for some foreign country. It has already been noticed by many contemporary sensible people that these two different sexes, victims of the same disease, as a rule consciously and instinctively seek and find each other. And in the given case they exemplify the proverb which has existed from olden times, one fisherman recognized another from far. And so, respected Doctor, thanks just to the aforesaid causes wisely understood by my uncle, many women prostitutes from various other countries then appeared after several years among us in Persia. And owing to the instinctive attitudes which, as I've already said, had been acquired during centuries by the local women of Persia without distinction of religion, towards morality and patriarchality in family traditions, these foreign women were unable to mix with the general mass of Persian women, with the consequence that from then on there began to be among us the two categories of women I've mentioned. Well then, owing to the fact that the majority of these foreign women living freely among us in Persia, and going about everywhere in the markets and other public places, often become objects for the gaze of our Persian men, there was gradually formed in the latter, of course, unconsciously, along with the already existing attitude towards women as mothers, yet another attitude towards women as simply females. The property of having this definite double attitude towards women, being transmitted by inheritance from generation to generation, has even among us finally become so rooted that at the present time our men not only distinguish these two categories of women by their appearance, as easily as one distinguishes between a man, a sheep, a dog, and an ass, etc., but there has even been formed in them a certain something which instinctively prevents them from mistaking a woman of one category for a woman of another. Even I myself could always unmistakably tell from a distance what sort of woman was passing. How I could tell this, whether by their walk or by some other sign, with the best will in the world, I could not now explain. But it is a fact that I could tell, and was never mistaken, although, as I've already told you, both categories of women wore similar veils. And every normal Persian, normal in the sense of not being under the influence of tambak, alcohol, or opium, the consumption of which has in recent times been unfortunately spreading among us ever more and more, can always unmistakably tell which women represents a woman mother and which a woman female, that is, a prostitute. To every normal Persian among us, a woman mother, to whatever religion she may belong, and regardless of family and personal relationships, is as his own sister, and a woman of the second category simply an animal who infallibly evokes in him a feeling of aversion. This property of instinctive relationship towards women is very strong in our men and is entirely independent of our consciousness. For example, even suppose it should happen somehow or other that the youngest and most beautiful woman of any district should find herself in the same bed with a man of the same district, this Persian man, even with all his willingness provided, I repeat that he were not under the influence of opium or alcohol, would be organically unable to treat her as a female. He would treat her as his own sister, and even if she herself should manifest organic actions towards him, he would only pity her the more, and regard her as possessed by an unclean power, and would try his best to help her free herself from this misfortune. And the same Persian man will, in a normal condition, also treat a woman of the second category, that is, a prostitute, as a woman female, since however young and beautiful she may be, he will inevitably experience an organic aversion to her, nor could he treat her as a woman unless there had been introduced into his organism the toxic products maleficent for people which I have enumerated. And so, respected doctor, I lived until my 20th year in Persia under these morals and traditions like every ordinary normal Persian. At 20, on account of shares I had inherited, I happened to become a partner in a certain large firm which exported Persian dried fruits to various communities in Europe. And my position in this firm, thanks to various circumstances independent of me, was such that I had to be its chief local representative in those countries of the continent of Europe to which these fruits were exported. At first, as I've already told you, I went to Russia. Then I went to Germany, Italy, and to other European countries. And now, finally, I have lived here in France already 7 years. In the life of none of these foreign countries does there exist any such sharply drawn distinction between these two types of women, between the woman mother and the woman prostitute, as I saw and felt during the whole of my youth in my native country. Everywhere among them, the attitude towards women is purely mental, that is, only thought out, not organic. For instance, a husband here, however faithful however unfaithful his wife may be, will never know it unless he sees or hears of it. But among us in Persia, without any seeing or any gossip, a husband can tell instinctively whether his wife is faithful. And the same thing applies to the woman. A woman among us can feel any infidelity on the part of her husband. As to this special instinctive feeling in people, several scientists from the continent of Europe have recently even made among us some very serious special investigations. As I happened by chance to learn, they came to the clear conclusion that in general, where polyandry and polygamy prevail, that is to say, where more than one husband and more than one wife are permitted by the established local morality, there is acquired in people a peculiar psycho-organic particularity in their relations as men and women. This psycho-organic particularity exists also in the people of our Persia, in consequence of the fact that, as you know, we, being followers of the Mohammedan religion, have the custom of polygamy, that is to say, each man is permitted by law to have as many as 7 wives. And this psycho-organic particularity in our Persian people, by the way, is that the feeling of the husband's infidelity never arises in any of the lawful wives concerning his other lawful wives. Such a feeling appears in one of the wives only when her husband is unfaithful with a strange woman. It is only now, respected doctor, that living here in Europe and seeing all that goes on between husbands and wives, I fully appreciate our custom of polygamy, so extremely sensibly established and so beneficial both for men and for women. Although every man among us is permitted several wives and not simply one, as is the case here in Europe where the Christian religion, which allows only one wife, is predominant, yet the honesty and conscientiousness of our men towards their wives are beyond compare with the honesty and conscientiousness existing among men here towards their one wife and their family in general. Just look around and see what's going on everywhere here. Glance around merely at these rooms of the Grand Café, where besides the ordinary professional prostitutes and gigolos who are constantly here, hundreds of men and women are always sitting at the little tables gaily conversing. Looking at these men and women, now you would say they were married couples who have come here together either to see Paris or on some family business. But as a matter of fact, it is practically certain that in all the halls of this Grand Café there is not a single couple among these men and women so gaily chatting, and about to go to some hotel together who are a legal man and wife, even though at the same time every one of them may be on paper a legal husband or wife. The other legal halves of the men and women sitting here who have remained at home in the provinces and are probably now thinking and telling their acquaintances positively that their legal wife or legal husband has gone to the world capital Paris to make some very important purchases for the family, or to meet somebody there very important for the family, or something else of the same sort. But in reality, in order to get here, these birds of passage have had to intrigue for a whole year and cook up every kind of story to convince their legal halves of the necessity of their trip, and now here in the company of deceivers and intriguers like themselves, in the name of and to the glory of the significance of epithallium, aided by that fine art which this great contemporary civilization has attained, they decorate their stay-at-home legal halves with the largest possible fine art horns. In Europe, thanks to the established order of family life, it has now already come about that if you meet a man and a woman together, and notice that while conversing, gay tones are heard in their voices and smiles appear on their faces, you can then be quite sure that very soon, if they have not already done so, they will very effectively and without fail put on some legal half a pair of the largest and most beautiful horns. Hence it is that any one slightly cunning man here may already be accounted a very honourable man, and the patriarchal father of a family. To those around him, it is of no concern that this honourable and patriarchal father of a family has perhaps at the same time, if of course his means permit, as many mistresses as he pleases on the side. On the contrary, those around him here usually show him even more respect for such a man, for one who is unable to have any mistresses at all. Here these honourable husbands, who have the means, not only have on one side, in addition to their one legal wife, 7, but sometimes even 7 times 7 illegal wives. And those European husbands who have not the means of supporting several illegal wives, in addition to their one legal wife, spend almost the whole of their time in what is called drooling, that is to say, for days on end, they stare at and, as it were, devour with their eyes every woman they meet. In other words, in their thoughts or in their feelings, they betray their one legal wife an innumerable number of times. But although among us in Persia a man can have as many as 7 legal wives, yet nevertheless all his thoughts and feelings are occupied day and night how he can best arrange both the inner and the outer life of these legal wives of his, and the latter in their turn are absorbed in him and try their utmost almost day and night to aid him in his life's duties. Here the reciprocal inner relationship between husband and wife is the same, just as almost all the inner life of the husband is spent in being unfaithful to his one legal wife. So also the inner life of this one wife, from the first day of their union, is always straying outside the family. For a European wife, as a rule, as soon as she is married, her husband becomes for her inner life, as they say, her own property. After the first night, being then secure in her ownership, she begins to devote the whole of her inner life to the pursuit of a certain something, that is, to the pursuit of that indefinable ideal, which from early childhood is gradually formed in every European girl, thanks to that famous education which is ever more and more always being inverted for them by various contemporary conscienceless writers. During my stay in these European countries, I have observed that there is never formed in the being of a woman here that something which should, in her as in our women, constantly maintain what is called organic shame, or at least the disposition to it, upon which feeling, in my opinion, what is called wifely duty is based, and which is just what instinctively aids her to refrain from those actions which make a woman immoral. That is why every woman here can very easily at any favourable opportunity, without either suffering or remorse of conscience, betray her legal husband. It is, in my opinion, owing to the absence of this shame in them, that here in Europe the line dividing the woman mother from the woman prostitute has gradually ceased to exist, and that these two categories of women have already long ago been merged into one, so that at the present time there is neither in the mind nor in the feelings of the men here that division of women into 2 categories which almost every Persian makes. Here one can now distinguish the woman mother from the woman female, only if one sees all her manifestations with one's own eyes. In the European conditions of family life, owing to the absence of the beneficent institution of polygamy, an institution which, in my opinion, should long ago have been introduced here, if only for the simple reason that, as statistics show, the women here far outnumber the men, there are thousands of other discomforts and improprieties which need not exist at all. And so, respected Doctor, the fundamental cause of my second vice was that being born and brought up here in the traditions of morality entirely opposed to those here. Start that again. And so, respected Doctor, the fundamental cause of my second vice was that being born and brought up in the traditions of morality entirely opposed to those here, I came here at an age when the animal passions in a man are especially strong. The ensuing evils for me personally arose chiefly from the fact that I came here while still very young, and according to the notions here, handsome, and owing to my general southern type, a great many women here for whom I represented a new and original type of male began a regular hunt after me. They hunted me like big game. And I was big game for them, not only on account of my specific type, a genuine southerner, but also on account of my gentleness and courtesy towards women, properties which had been instilled in me from my earliest childhood in my associations with our Persian women mothers. When I came here and began meeting the women here, I was of course even unconsciously on my part gentle and courteous towards them also. And so, meeting with the women here and at first only talking with them, chiefly on the subject of contemporary civilization, and on the backwardness, as it were, of our Persia in comparison, I then, of course, under the influence of alcohol, which I was then already consuming in rather large quantities, fell for the first time, that is to say, I, as a prospective father of a family, behaved vilely. Although this cost me at the time much suffering and remorse of conscience, yet the environment together again with the action of this alcohol caused me to fall a second time, and thereafter everything headed so to say down an inclined plane, and led to the point where I am now, indeed in this respect, a most filthy animal. Especially now at times, whenever I happen to be completely free from the influence of alcohol, I suffer moral anguish and loathe myself with the whole of my being, and at such moments I hasten all the more to pour this alcohol into myself again, in order to forget myself, and thus drown my sufferings. Having lived this ugly life in the countries of Europe I enumerated, I finally settled down here in Paris, in precisely that European city to which women come from every part of Europe and from other continents with the obvious intention of putting horns on their other legal halves. And here in Paris, I've now become entirely addicted to both these human vices, that is, to alcohol and, as you have said, to petticoat chasing. And I run left and right without any sane reasoning at all. And now the satisfaction of both these vices is more necessary to me than the satisfaction of my hunger. That is how it has all gone with me up to the present moment, and what will come next I do not know and do not care to know. I always even try my best, and struggle with myself not to think about it. As he said these last words, he sincerely sighed and dejectedly dropped his head. I then asked him, "But tell me, please, are you really not afraid of being infected with those terrible diseases which these women usually suffer from, whom a petticoat chaser like you runs after?" At this question of mine he again sighed deeply, and after a short pause told me as follows. "Eke, my esteemed and worthy doctor, in recent years I have thought about this question a great deal. It has even become for me a subject of such interest that in a certain sense it has been a blessed means whereby my inner odious life has, in spite of everything, flowed more or less endurably. As a physician you will, I think, probably be greatly interested to know how and why this same question interested me so much several years ago, and to what conclusions I arrived, after I had, in a relatively normal state, very seriously observed and studied it. About 5 years ago I had such a fit of depression that even alcohol scarcely had any effect on me, nor pacified my psychic state. And it so happened just then that I often met with certain acquaintances and friends who talked a great deal about filthy diseases, and how easily one could be infected with them. From these conversations I myself began thinking rather often about myself, and little by little I began fretting about my health, almost like a hysterical woman. I used often to reflect that being almost always drunk, and constantly having affairs with such infected women, that evidently, even if for some reason or other I had so far no obvious symptom for these diseases, I must nevertheless, in all probability, be already infected with one of them. After such reflections, I first began consulting various specialists, in order to find out what were the early symptoms of whatever disease I already may have had. Although none of the local specialists found anything at all in me, I nevertheless continued to doubt, because on the one hand my fretting about my health, and on the other hand my own common sense continued to assure me that I must certainly already have been infected with one of these terrible diseases. All this brought me to the point that I decided at any expense to have a consultation here in Paris, but this time with the leading specialists from the whole of Europe. I could afford myself this because, owing to the World War, when transport had everywhere broken down and all commodities had gone up in price, our firm, having everywhere very large stocks of dried fruit in storage, had this year made considerable profits, a fairly good portion of which fell to my share. When I called these European celebrities together, they unanimously pronounced, after all kinds of very detailed investigations and what are called chemical analyses, known to them themselves, that there was not the slightest sign of any venereal disease in my organism. Although this finding of theirs put an end to the chronic fretting about my health, yet it was the cause of the growth in me of such a strong feeling of inquisitiveness and curiosity to clear up this question, that from then on it became a sort of mania with me, a kind of idea fixe. And also from then on, the serious observation and study of everything concerning these diseases animated and justified the sense of what I have called my odious life. During this period of my life, I made these observations and studies of mine at all times with my whole inner real I, while in a drunken, semi-drunken, and also sober state. And then, among other things, I also read assiduously every kind of literature existing here in Europe concerning these diseases, and also most of the books on this question in French and German. This I could easily do because, as you see, I have such a command of French that you can scarcely guess that I am not a real French intellectual, and with the German language also I get along very well, because I lived a fairly long time in Germany, and always in my free time studied their language and their literature for want of something to do. So when I became interested in this question, I was able to become fully acquainted with all the knowledge that exists in contemporary civilization on the subject of venereal diseases. In this literature, there appeared to be hundreds of theories and hundreds of hypotheses concerning the causes of venereal infection, but I could not discover one convincingly categorical explanation how and why some people are infected with these diseases and others not. And I soon became convinced that I could not clear up for myself with the knowledge existing on this question at the present time here in Europe. From all this literature, putting aside of course and not even mentioning the multitude of those thick scientific books here, whose contents immediately show every more or less normal person that they were written by people who were, as it is said, complete ignoramuses on these questions, that is to say, not specialists in human diseases at all, I got the general impression that people were infected and fall ill with venereal diseases only owing to their own uncleanliness. When I made this categorical deduction, there was nothing left to me but to concentrate all my attention upon finding out in what my personal cleanliness particularly consisted, which had so far protected me against infection. I then began to deliberate with myself as follows. I do not dress any more cleanly than everybody else living here in Europe. I wash my hands and face every morning like everybody else. Once a week I make a point of going to a Turkish bath, also it seems like everyone. And in this way I turned over many things in my mind, and with the result I found nothing in which in this respect I was exceptional. And yet the fact remained that from my loathsome life I of course ran more chances of being infected. From then on my thoughts were guided by two definite convictions already fully established in me. In the first place, that anyone having relations with such women must inevitably sooner or later be infected, and secondly, that only cleanliness protects one from such infection. In this manner, I continued to reflect for a whole week until I suddenly remembered a certain habit of mine, which here in Europe I always scrupulously concealed from my acquaintances. I remembered, namely, about that habit of mine which is called among us in Persia abdest. The custom of abdest, which according to the notions here might be called ablution, is one of the chief customs among us in Persia. Strictly speaking, every follower of the Mohammedan religion must obey this custom, though it is practiced particularly strictly only by Mohammedans of the Shiite sect, and as almost the whole of Persia is composed of Shiites, the custom is nowhere so widely spread as among us in Persia. This custom is that every adherent of the Shiite sect, male as well as female, must after every toilet unfailingly wash his sex organs. For this purpose every family has the necessary appurtenances, considered among us even as the most important, consisting of a special vessel, a particular kind of bowl called iberk, and the richer the family, the more of these bowls they must have, since such a bowl must at once and without fail be put at the disposal of every newly arrived guest. I myself was from early childhood also personally accustomed to this habit, and it gradually so entered into my daily life that even when I came here to Europe, where this custom does not exist, I could not live a single day without making this ablution. For instance, it is much easier for me to go without washing my face, even after a debauch, than not to wash certain parts of my body with cold water after the toilet. At present, living here in Europe, I not only have to put up with a great many inconveniences owing to this habit of mine, but I even have to forego some of the modern comfort which I could easily afford. For instance, I now live in Paris, where, owing to my means, I could well afford to live at the very best hotel, with every modern comfort. But, thanks to this habit of mine, I cannot do this, but am obliged to live in some dirty hotel, situated far from the centre, and from all those places where I have to be almost every day. In the hotel where I now live, there are no comforts beyond this single comfort, which is very important for me, and this is due to the fact that, being of old construction, this hotel has water closets of the old type, and not of the new contemporary American invention, and it is just that old system which is the most convenient and suitable for this habit of mine. It is quite likely that I even half-consciously chose France as my chief dwelling place, because it is still possible to find everywhere here, especially in the provinces, water closets of the old system as among us in Persia. In other countries of Europe, this, as they now call it, Asiatic system, scarcely exists. It has almost everywhere been exchanged for the American system, with its comfortable polished easy chairs, upon which I personally could only rest and read the book called Decameron. And so, my honourable doctor, when I suddenly remembered this habit of mine, I at once understood without any further doubt that if I had hitherto escaped being infected with some filthy disease, it was solely because I frequently washed my sex organs with cold water. Having said these last words, this sympathetic young Persian extended his arms upwards, and with his whole being exclaimed, "Blessed forever be the memory of those who created for us that beneficial custom." He said nothing further for a long while, but looked pensively at a party of Americans sitting nearby who were discussing at that moment whether women dress better in England or in America, and then he suddenly turned to me with the following words: "My highly esteemed and honourable doctor, during my acquaintance with you, I have become quite convinced that you are very well educated and, as is said, very well read. Will you be so kind as to give me your weighty opinion, so that I might at least understand and solve one problem which during recent years has aroused my curiosity, and which when I am comparatively sober often arises in me and disturbs my thoughts. The point is that living here in Europe, where people profess the religion, whose followers compose almost half the world, I have not up to now come across a single good custom in their ordinary life, whereas among us who profess the Mohammedan religion, there are very many. What's wrong? What's the cause of it? Were there no good ordinances foredesigned by the founder of that great religion for the ordinary life of people, the followers of that religion? Well, my boy, as this young Persian had become sympathetic to me during our acquaintance, I could not refuse him this request, and I decided to explain the question to him, but also of course in such a form that he would not even suspect who I was and what was my genuine nature. You say that in the religion which half the world professes, and you probably mean the Christian religion, there are not such good customs as in your Mohammedan religion. Are there not? On the contrary. In that religion there were many more good customs than in any of the religions of today. In none of the ancient religious teachings were so many good regulations for ordinary everyday life laid down as in just that teaching on which this same Christian religion was founded. If the followers of this great religion themselves, especially those who are called the elders of the Church of the Middle Ages, treated this religion step by step as Bluebeard treated his wives, that is to say, put them into derision and changed all their beauty and charm, that is already quite a different matter. In general, you must know that all the great genuine religions which have existed down to the present time, created as history itself testifies, by men of equal attainment in regard to the perfecting of their pure reason, are always based on the same truths. The difference in those religions is only in the definite regulations they lay down for the observance of certain details, and of what are called rituals. And this difference is the result of the deliberate adoption by the great founders of these regulations, which suited the degree of mental perfection of the people of the given period. At the root of every new doctrine upon which religions are founded, dogmas are always to be found, which had already been taken from earlier religions, and which had already been well fixed in the life of the people. And in this case, the saying is fully justified which has existed among people from old, there is nothing new under the sun. The only things new in these religious teachings, as I have said, are the small details, intentionally adapted by the great founders to the degree of mental perfection of the people of the given epoch. And so, as the root of this same doctrine upon which the Christian religion is based there was placed among the whole of the previously existing great teaching, which is now called Judaism, whose followers once also numbered almost, as is said, half the world. The great founders of the Christian religion, having taken the Judaic doctrine as their basis, changed only its outer details according to the degree of mental development of the contemporaries of Jesus Christ, and in it they effectively provided for everything necessary for the welfare of people. Provision was made in it, as is said, both for the soul and for the body, and it even provided all the necessary regulations for a peaceful and happy existence. And this was all surpassingly wisely provided for in such a way that this religion might be suitable also for people of much later epochs. Had the doctrine of this religion remained unchanged, it might even perhaps have suited these contemporary people, who, by the way, our Mullah Nasser Eddin defines by his expression, "He will blink only if you poke his eye with a rafter." At its origin, there entered into this Christian religion, besides those specially established regulations for ordinary existence, which met the needs of the contemporaries of Jesus Christ, also many excellent customs, which were already in existence and had become well fixed in the life of the people who were followers of the Judaic religion. Even those good customs which now exist among you in the Mohammedan religion were transmitted to you from the Judaic religion. Take, for example, just that custom of sunniyat, or circumcision, which you mentioned. This custom was at first contained in this Christian religion also, and in the beginning was obligatorily and strictly carried out by all its followers. Only subsequently did it very quickly and suddenly entirely disappear from the Christian religion. If you wish, my young friend, I will tell you in detail about the arising of this custom, and you will understand from it why a custom so good for the health and normal life of people was included in the Judaic religion. And since the Judaic religion was made the basis of the Christian religion, this custom also could not fail to be taken over and introduced into the process of the ordinary life of the followers of the Christian religion. This custom, which you call sunniyat, was first created and introduced into the Judaic religious doctrine by the great Moses. And why the great Moses introduced this custom into the religion of the Judaic people, I learned from a very ancient Chaldean manuscript. It was said in this manuscript that when the great Moses was the leader of the Judaic people and conducted them from the land of Egypt to the land of Canaan, he constated the fact during the journey that among the youths and children of the people confided to him from above, there was very widely spread the disease then called Mordurton, which contemporary people call onanism. It was further said in the manuscript that having constated this fact, the great Moses was greatly perturbed, and from then on began observing very closely in order to discover the causes of this evil and some means of uprooting it. These researches of his led this incomparable sage later to write a book under the title of Tukha Tez Nalul Pan, which in contemporary language means the quintessence of my reflections. With the contents of this remarkable book I also once happened to become acquainted. At the beginning of the explanation about the disease Mordurton, it was said, among other things, that the human organism has been brought by great nature to such perfection that each and every organ has been provided with a means of defence against every external contingency, and hence that if any organ should function incorrectly in people, it must always be the people themselves who are to blame, owing to their own established conditions of everyday life. And concerning the causes themselves of the appearance of Mordurton among children, it was said in chapter 6, verse 11 of this incomparable book, that this disease occurs in children for the following reasons. Among the definite substances elaborated by the human organism and constantly thrown off by it as waste, there is a definite substance called kulnabo. This substance is in general elaborated in the organism of beings for the purpose of neutralizing other also definite substances necessary for the functioning of their sex organs, and it is formed and participates in the functioning of the said organs from the very beginning of the arising of the beings of both sexes, that is to say, from their infancy. Great nature has so arranged it that after its utilization, the residue of this substance is discharged from the organism of boys at the place between the Tulcototino and the Sarnunonino, and in girls from the places between the Cartotacnian hills. The parts of the organism of boys located at the end of what is called the genital member, and which are named in this incomparable book Tulcototino and Sarnunonino, are named by contemporary medicine there glans penis and preputim penis, and the Cartotacnian hills covered what is called the clitoris of girls are called labia majora or labia minoria. or, as is said in common language, the large and small obscene lips. For the substance called narbo, contemporary medicine has no name at all, this independent substance being entirely unknown to it. Contemporary terrestrial medicine has a name only for the general mass of those substances, among which is also the substance called narbo, and this total mass is called smegma, a composition of entirely heterogeneous substances secreted by various what are called glands, which have nothing in common with each other, as for instance the grease gland, the Bartholinian gland, the Cowperian, Nolonilian, and others. The separation and volatilization of these waste substances should, in accordance with the providence of great nature, be induced for the said places by means of all kinds of chance contacts and by various movements occurring in the atmosphere. But, unforeseen by nature, the clothing which people have invented for themselves prevents the said factors from freely affecting the separation and volatilization of these substances, with the result that this narbo, remaining for a long time on these places, promotes the arising of perspiration. Moreover, as this substance is in general the very best medium for the multiplication of what are called bacteria, which exist in the atmosphere, as well as in what are called the subjective spheres of all kinds of things coming into direct contact with the children, there occurs from this multiplying there on the given parts of the organism of children a process called itching. On account of this itching, children begin, unconsciously at first, to rub or scratch these places. Later, as there are concentrated in these parts of the organism all the ends of the nerves created by nature for the special sensation required for the completion of the sacred process El Murano, which normally arises in adult people at the end of what is called copulation, and as especially at a certain period, when, according to the providence of great nature, there proceeds in these organs of children a process of preparation for future sex functioning, they experience from this rubbing or scratching a certain peculiar pleasant sensation. They therefore begin intentionally, having instinctively realized from which of their actions this pleasant sensation is evoked in them, to rub these places, even when there is no itching. And thus the ranks of the little mordortentists on the earth are always increasing by leaps and bounds. As regards just what measures the great Moses took for eradicating that evil, I learned not from the aforementioned book Tukhartes Nalul Pan, but from the contents of an also very ancient papyrus. From the contents of this papyrus, it could be clearly seen that the great Moses gave practical effect to the thoughts set down on his question in the book Tukhartes Nalul Pan, by creating for his people those two religious rites, one of which is called Sikt Ner Chorn and the other Sel Putz Kan. The sacred Sikt Ner Chorn was specially created for boys, and the sacred Sel Putz Kan for girls, and they were to be obligatorily performed on all children of both sexes. The rite of the Sikt Ner Chorn, for instance, was identical with the Orsuniat. By cutting what is called the Vodiano, or the frenum penis of boys, the connection is severed between the head and the skin covering it, and thus there is obtained the free movement of the skin, or as it is called, preputium penis. According to the information which has come down to us from ancient times, and also according to our own common sense, it is plain that the great Moses, who, as we learn from another source, was a very great authority on medicine, wished by this means to secure that the totality of substances accumulating in the said places might of itself be mechanically removed, owing to all kinds of accidental contact, and thus cease to become a factor for the arising of the mentioned maleficent itching. Concerning the vast learning of the great Moses in the province of medicine, many diverse historical sources agree that he obtained his medical knowledge during his stay in Egypt as a pupil of the Egyptian high priests, to whom this knowledge had come down from their ancestors of the continent Atlantis, the first and last genuinely learned beings of the earth the members of the society then called a Cowden. The beneficial results of the customs then created by the great Moses even now continue to be fairly visible in practice. Concerning, for instance, the custom of circumcision in particular, I, being a good diagnostician, and able to tell from one glance at a man's face what disharmony he has in his organism, can safely say that this terrible children's disease of onanism is scarcely ever found among those children upon whom this rite has been performed, whereas the children of those parents who fail to observe this custom are almost all subject to it. The exceptions in this respect are only the children of those parents who are indeed cultured in the full sense of the word, and who clearly understand that the future normalmentation of their children depends exclusively upon whether they do or do not contract this disease in their childhood or youth. Such cultured parents know very well that if even once the sensation of the climax of what is called the Uemon-van-Nothinian process occurs in what is called the nervous system of their children before they reach majority, they will already never have the full possibility of normalmentation when they become adult, and hence it is that such cultured parents always consider it their first and chief duty towards their children to educate them in this respect. Unlike most contemporary parents, they do not consider that the education of children consists in badgering them to learn by rote as much poetry as possible, composed by mordor-tentist psychopaths, or in teaching them to click their heels well before their acquaintances, in which accomplishments, according to the notions of people of recent times, the whole education of children unfortunately consists. And so, my dear friend, and though very depraved, yet nevertheless sympathetic young man, these two rites were created by the great Moses and introduced then into the ordinary life of the Judaic people in order to counteract that maleficent invention of clothes, thanks to which those factors were destroyed which were provided by nature for the protection of these organs from the harmful action of the substances given off by them. And these two rites were transmitted from generation to generation, both to the followers of this Judaic religion themselves, as well as to others who took over these useful rites almost unchanged. And it was only after the death of the great King Solomon that the rite Zel Putz Can ceased for some reason or other to be performed even by the followers of this Judaic religion, and only the rite Six Ner Chorn automatically continued to be performed and reached the contemporary representatives of that race. And this custom, together with many other ancient Judaic customs, also reached the followers of the Christian religion, who at first observed it very strictly in their everyday life. But very soon both this custom itself and even the information about its adoption among them similarly quickly disappeared from among the followers of this then still new religion. Yes, my dear friend, if only the teaching of the divine Jesus Christ were carried out in full conformity with its original, then the religion unprecedentedly wisely founded on it would not only be the best of all existing religions, but even of all religions which may arise and exist in the future. Except for the custom of polygamy, there is nothing in the Mohammedan religion which was not also in the Judaic as well as in the Christian teachings. The custom of polygamy, established on the basis of the scientific deductions of the then famous Arabian learned being Naulan el-Aul, was introduced into the everyday life of people in general after the period of the founding of the Christian religion. Your religion arose much later, and its contents were intentionally restricted by its great creators, who had it in mind to lay particular stress on certain everyday customs. They did this because at the time there were clearly manifest both the decline of the Christian religion and the disappearance in ordinary people of the capacity for contemplation, that is, for the state in which alone the truths indicated in the detailedly genuine religious teachings can be understood. Having noticed all this, the great creators of the Mohammedan religion decided on the one hand to simplify the teaching itself, and on the other hand to emphasize certain customs, so that the everyday life of the followers of this new teaching, who had lost the capacity for contemplation, and consequently the possibility of understanding truth consciously, might at least mechanically flow more or less tolerably. Just at that time, among other customs, they established and laid particular stress on the customs you mentioned of sunniyat, abdest, and polygamy, the beneficial results of which we can see even now in practice. For example, as you yourself have justly observed, thanks to circumcision and ablution, one rarely finds among the followers of this religion either onanism or certain venereal diseases. And thanks to polygamy, we see among the followers of this religion such a reciprocal, so to say, psycho-organic maintenance of the foundation of family life, as is almost entirely absent among the followers of the Christian religion. Of the useful customs originally contained in the Christian religion, and which were introduced by the creators of that religion into the life of its followers, for the preservation of health, and for the maintenance of the foundations of morality necessary for a happy life, nothing now remains except the custom of periodic fasting, that is, of abstaining at certain times of the year from the consumption of certain edible products. And even this one surviving good custom is either already fading completely out of ordinary life of the followers of this religion, or its observance is so changing year by year that no shock is obtained from it for the fasters, though it was just for that shock that this fast was established. The changes now taking place in the process of this Christian custom of fasting are very characteristic and provide an excellent example for understanding how, in general, all the good Christian customs have little by little undergone change until they have finally entirely ceased to exist. A good illustration is the present-day observance of this fast by those called the Russian Orthodox Christians. These Russian Orthodox Christians took their religion entirely from those called the Orthodox Greeks, from whom, together with many other Christian customs, this same custom of fasting also passed to them. Most of the millions of these Russian Orthodox Christians still continue to fast, as is said, rigorously, in conformity with what is called the Orthodox Code, now existing there. But as to the manner of their fasting, one cannot help recalling the saying of our dear Mullah Nasser Eddin in such cases, "Isn't it all the same if I sing like a donkey as long as they call me a nightingale?" The fasting of these Russian Orthodox Christians is just a case of this kind. As long as they are called Christians, and moreover Orthodox, even though they receive no shock whatever from the fast, is it not all the same? As I've already said, these Russian Orthodox Christians, even of the present time, very strictly observe the seasons and the days of the fasts indicated in the aforesaid codes. But as to what should and should not be consumed as food during a fast, just in that question is buried the left paw of the curly-haired dog of the ex-Emperor Wilhelm. You will clearly understand how these contemporary Russian Orthodox Christians fast if I repeat to you the exact words of one of these genuine Russian Orthodox Christians spoken to me not long ago before there in Russia. I used to meet this Russian there on certain business, and even became somewhat friendly with him and visited him in his home. He was considered by those around him a very good Christian, and the patriarchal father of a family. He was descended from what they call the Old Believers. Here, my boy, you might as well know that certain of the beings who compose this large group, Russia, are called by the rest Old Believers. Old Believers is the name given to those Orthodox Christians whose ancestors several centuries ago declined to accept the new rules then laid down by somebody or other for Russian Orthodox Christians, but remained faithful followers of the previously existing rules also laid down by somebody or other only a century or two before the given religious schism, such as usually occurs among them from time to time. And so the said worthy Russian old believer, I continued to the young Persian, once when we were dining together at his house in the company of several other Russians, also Orthodox Christians, turned to me and said, "Oh dear, by the way, I must tell you that it is common among the beings of this group there, after the second glass of genuine Russian vodka, to call their acquaintances by various pet names, such as Old Dear, my Zapupuchonchik, my pot-bellied beauty, my little brown jug, and so on and so forth." And so this worthy genuine Orthodox Christian, addressing me as Old Dear, said, "Never mind, Old Dear, we shall soon be having Lent, and then we shall feast together on real Russian dishes. To tell the truth, here in Russia we almost always eat the same things during the meat periods. But it is quite a different story during the fasts, especially during Lent. Not a day passes but one is privileged to see some of the most tasty dishes. You know what, Old Dear? I made the other day a remarkably interesting discovery on this subject. This new discovery of mine is miles above the discovery of that old codger Copernicus, who, when he was once lying dead drunk on the ground, clearly sensed, it seems, that the earth goes round. Ah, what a marvel! What a discovery! In our own Mother Moscow alone, hundreds of thousands of such discoveries are probably made every day. No, my discovery is a real one, and exceedingly instructive and substantial. This discovery of mine is that we have all been complete fools and hopeless idiots ever to have imagined and been fairly convinced that for the host of good, varied and most tasty dishes during Lent, we are indebted to the famous art of our chefs and cooks. On a day peculiarly blessed for those near to me, when I became worthy to understand this truth, that is to say, when our incomparable Duniyasha finally succeeded in placing within the layers of the pie, for the Gromwell fish soup with turbot livers, a series of secondary layers, I understood with my whole being that this had been a great mistake on our part. First, I understood this myself, and afterwards I proved it to the whole of my household, that if we have so many varied and most tasty dishes during Lent, we are indebted only to our blessed and glorious fish alone. During fasts, and especially during Lent, our homes are made happy by the frequent visits of the most honourable sturgeon, and the estimable sterlet, and the respected dried sturgeon, and the ever-memorable turbot, and Her Illustrious Highness the salmon, and the musical white sturgeon, and the serenely plastic mackerel, and the eternally angry pike, and the ever-demure guinead, and the leaping alive trout, and the beauty trioshka, and the proud chamois, and that worthy personality bream, and all our other like benefactors and protectors. Merely the names alone of these our givers of good and felicity are already for us the greatest gift of God. When we hear their names, our hearts almost leap within us. These names of theirs are not just names, but real music. Can one really compare the sounds of the music invented there by various Beethovenings and Chopinings and other fashionable triflers with the sounds of the names of these blessed fishes? Every time we hear the names of these glorious creatures, a state of bliss flows within us and courses through our veins and nerves. Blessed fishes, first created by our Creator, have mercy on us and sustain us also in these meat days. Amen. After this prayer, this worthy Orthodox Russian Christian drained a monster glass of genuine refined Russian vodka and stared fondly at a little statue of Venus and Psyche which stood nearby. And indeed, my friend, almost every Russian Orthodox Christian has a similar idea of fasting and a similar attitude towards it. During these Christian fasts, which passed to them from the Orthodox Greeks, they all eat the flesh of fish. It is not considered a sin among them to eat the flesh of fish, and they eat it heartily as a fast dish. I personally find only one thing incomprehensible. From where did these Russian sorry Orthodox get the idea that during the Christian fasts, especially during Lent, the flesh of fish may be eaten. I find it incomprehensible because the Orthodox Christians from whom they took this religion, namely the Greeks, neither in the past nor in the present have ever eaten or do eat the flesh of fish during fasts. Even the Greeks of today eat fish during Lent only on one day, and even then in accordance with the code of the Orthodox Church, in memory of a day associated with the divine Jesus Christ. The result of a fast permitting the consumption of the flesh of fish not only gives no shock at all to the fasters, but is even directly contrary to what the divine Jesus Christ himself intended and taught, and for which this custom was established by the great creators of this Christian religion. In confirmation of what I've just told you, you might as well, my young friend, listen to what I once chanced to read about the Christian fasting in an ancient Judaic Essenian manuscript. In this ancient Judaic Essenian manuscript, it was stated that the custom established for the followers of the teaching of Jesus Christ of fasting at certain times of the year was instituted long after his death, namely in the 214th year after his birth. The custom of fasting was instituted and introduced into the Christian religion by the great secret Chelnuanian Council. This secret Chelnuanian Council was convened by all the followers of the then still new teaching of Jesus Christ in the locality of Kelnuk, lying on the shores of the Dead Sea. Hence it is known in the history of the Christian religion as the Chelnuanian Council. And it was held in secret because the followers of the teachings of Jesus Christ were then everywhere rigorously persecuted by the power-possessing people. The power-possessing people persecuted them because they greatly feared that if people lived according to this teaching, then although they themselves, namely the power-possessing people, could also live very well, yet all the motives for displaying their power would disappear, and thereby those shocks would cease, the satisfaction of which evoked the tickling of their inner god named self-love. It was just during that Chelnuanian Council that its members first laid down the rule that the followers of the teaching of Jesus Christ should on certain days abstain from consuming certain edible products for food. And the initial cause of the instruction of this fast was the dispute at this Chelnuanian Council between two then famous learned men, namely the great Tertulian and the great Greek philosopher Vegendiadi. The great Tertulian was the representative of all the followers of the teachings of Jesus Christ, settled on the shores of the Red Sea, while the philosopher Vegendiadi was the representative of all the then followers of that teaching in Greece. The philosopher Vegendiadi was famous for his learning only in his own country, but Tertulian was famous all over the earth. He was considered the greatest authority on the laws of the inner organization of man, and also an authority on the science then called alchemy. Not of course the alchemic science of which contemporary people have a notion and which they express by the same word. The famous dispute between the great Tertulian and the Vegendiadi arose on the following occasion. The philosopher Vegendiadi, it seems, occupied 2 days in affirming and approving that it was absolutely necessary to spread among all the followers of the teachings of Jesus the notion that to kill animals for the purpose of consuming their flesh for food was the greatest sin, and moreover that such flesh was very harmful to the health and so on. After the philosopher Vegendiadi, several other representatives ascended the rostrum and spoke for or against his case. Finally, as this manuscript stated, the great Tertulian, with measured dignity, slowly mounted the rostrum and spoke in the manner proper to him, clearly and calmly. According to the text of this manuscript, he then spoke as follows. I fully concur in all the evidence and arguments set forth here by our brother in Christ, the philosopher Vegendiadi. I, for my part, will even add to all he has said, that to cut short other lives merely to stuff one's own belly is an infamy of infamies, such as only men is capable of. Had I not also been interested in this question for many years, and had I not reached certain entirely different conclusions, then after all that our brother in Christ Vegandiadi has said here, I should not hesitate a moment, but should urge and conjure you all not to delay until tomorrow, but without looking behind, to hasten back to your towns, and there in the public squares to cry aloud, Stop, stop, people, consume no more meat for food. This practice of yours is not only contrary to all the commandments of God, but is the cause of all your diseases. As you see, I do not do this now, and I do not do so only because during my long years of unremitting study of this question, I have, as I've already told you, arrived at an entirely different, definite conclusion. Concerning the definite conclusion at which I have arrived, I can now tell you only this, that it will never happen on the earth that all people will profess one and the same religion. Hence, in addition to our Christian religion, other religions will always exist, and it is not possible to be certain that the followers of these other religions will also abstain from consuming meat. But if we cannot now be certain that at some time or other all people on earth will abstain from meat, then we must now, as regards the consumption of meat, take quite other more practicable measures, because if one part of mankind consumes meat and the other part does not, then according to the results of my experimental investigations, the greatest of evils, than which nothing could be worse, would befall the peoples who did not consume meat. Namely, as my detailed experiments have shown me, among people who do not consume meat, but who nevertheless live among those who do, the formation ceases of what is called willpower. My experiments prove to me that although when they abstain from meat, people's bodily health improves, nevertheless, when such abstainers find themselves mixing with those who consume meat, their psychic state inevitably grows worse, in spite of the fact that the state of their organism may at the same time sometimes improve. Thus, a good result for people who abstain from meat can be obtained exclusively only if they live always in complete isolation. As regards the people who constantly consume meat, or those products which contain the element called eknoch, then the appearance of the state of their organism undergoes no change. Nevertheless, their psyche, especially its chief feature, which is sometimes designated by the word the character of man, gradually changes in regard to positiveness and morality for the worse, beyond all recognition. I must tell you that I made all these deductions from the experiments I was enabled to conduct over a period of many years, thanks to two good philanthropic men, namely to the rich shepherd Allah Ek Linak and his money, and to the scientist we all respect, El Kuna Nasser, with his remarkable invention, the apparatus Aristodesok. By means of this said remarkable apparatus Aristodesok, I was enabled for several years to register daily the general state of the organism of all those thousands of people who lived under test conditions at the expense of the good shepherd Allah Ek Linak. May our Creator multiply his flocks. Well then, thanks to these experimental researches of mine, I became clearly convinced that if people continue to consume meat for their food, it will be very bad for them, and that on the other hand, if only some of them should abstain, no good would come of this either. I therefore after devoted myself entirely for a time to finding out what could nevertheless be done for the future welfare of the majority of the people. At the outset, I then established for myself two categorical propositions. The first, that people accustomed for so many centuries to consuming meat for their food would never without their weak wills be able to make themselves cease consuming it in order to overcome this criminal tendency of theirs. And the second, that even if people should decide not to eat meat, and should in fact keep their decision for a certain time, and should even lose the habit of eating meat, they would nevertheless never be able to abstain from eating it for a sufficient length of time to acquire a total aversion to it. They would not be able to do so, because never on the earth will it occur that all people will have the same religion or form a single government, without which condition there can never exist, common to all, any suggestive, prohibitive, penal, or other kind of compulsory influence, owing to which alone people possessing in general the property of being stimulated by example, aroused by envy, and influenced magnetically, might be enabled to keep forever a resolution once taken. Notwithstanding these two facts, incontestably clear in my conviction, I nevertheless, with these facts as the basis of my subsequent researches, persevered in my search for some possible way of escape from the unhappy situation confronting people. Of course, all my further investigations on a large scale proceeded again with the aid of the inexhaustible wealth of the herdsman Allah Ek Linak, and the wonderful apparatus of the wise El Kuna Nasser. The results of these last researches of mine made it clear to me that although in general people's psyche does indeed deteriorate from the constant introduction into their organism of the substance eknoch, yet this substance has a particularly harmful effect only at certain times of the year. End of part 2.